Okay, I'm an idiot. Hi, I'm Cliff, and this is my garage. And if this is your first time joining me, thanks for dropping by. In the course of making this video, I've had a bit of a disaster. I finished recording everything and uploaded it to my computer. A few weeks later, I went to edit the video together and discovered, to my dismay, that the first file was corrupted. Fortunately, everything else was fine. The lost file was mostly some initial setup work that's covered in other videos, and I'll give you references to those in the video description down below. Now, of the actual work that's specific to this video, all that's missing is the removal of one nut, and I can easily show you how to do that. Our first step to removing the Cayman rear strut is to remove the wheel and tires. Set that aside. Then we need to take care of the brakes, and you need to start off by removing the brake pads, which give you a link to a video in the video description, and then you need to remove or actually relocate the brake calipers. Now, you don't want to actually remove them, as in you don't want to disconnect the brake line here. You just want to pull the bolts out, and then I use like a piece of copper wire to simply hang it back here. And I'll give you a link to another video in the video description that shows you how to do that very simply. The last step in our prep work to remove the strut is to disconnect the drop link for the sway bar from the wheel carrier by removing this bolt here. And I'll give you a link to another video in the video description that shows you how to do that. The first step in the process of actually removing the strut from the rear of the Cayman is to disconnect the rear tow control arm. Now, this is an upgraded Tarot model again, and your tow control link, if you're running stock ones, will look a bit different, not a whole lot. And they both connect in the same way, which is a stud that goes up through this part of the wheel carrier, and it's held on by this 19mm nut. So you'll have to just remove this nut, and if you find that this stud is spinning on you, there is a hex socket in the end of it here that you can use like a hex driver and a breaker bar or a ratchet, or you can just simply use like an Allen wrench, and that way you can hold the stud still while you turn the nut and take it off. What you should do is just run it up to where the nut is completely covering and protecting the stud, and then just use a hammer to just pop this a few times and break this connection loose. It's probably kind of stuck, and you'll be able to, should after a couple of hammer blows, maybe 3 or 4, drive it down. If you find that you're having problem, soak it real good with my favorite penetrating oil, which is CRC Knocker Loose. That works 99% of the time. If you find it still stuck and being very stubborn, then you might have to apply heat to this knuckle right here that's part of the wheel carrier, that's what it's called, in order to expand this enough to break this loose. What you don't want to do is take the other end loose, because if you take the other end loose, now you have to re-measure and reset the toe. Simply breaking this loose and pulling it around to the side, getting it out of the way, that's sufficient to let you get the strut out of there, and it also preserves the toe setting for when you reassemble this. All right, that's it for the prep work and the first step in the process. Now we can go back to the original video. I've picked the car up to get a better view underneath here. What we're going to do next is a little unnerving the first time you try it, because it seems a little scary. We're going to disconnect the drive axle from the transmission back there. And it's a little intimidating because it sounds like it's a major job, but it's really very simple the way that Porsche has designed this. What we have here is a pair of hubs or plates. One is coming out of the transmission, and it flares out into a back plate here. And then this front plate, or this front hub, is connected to the drive axle through what I presume is like a U-joint up underneath this boot here. And this is a dry connection. There is no lubrication, there's no grease, there's no kind of fluids, there's no spline shaft. It's just essentially two metal plates hooked together with these 6 bolts. So it's really very easy. Now these bolts are a little different in that these are not Torx heads. These are triple squares. Torx and triple squares look a lot alike, but they're not the same thing. The triple square gets its name from the fact that well, here's a triple square bit, and it looks like a drive shaft spline, or like a power takeoff coming out of the back of a tractor. It's the shape is what would be formed if you took 3 squares and overlapped them on top of each other. Each one rotated 120 degrees, and it forms a 12-pointed star. And this bit just goes right in there, and then it comes in a set of bits like this and a socket that fits them, although I'm sure that this is just some standard size socket that these bits would fit into. You're going to have a couple of challenges in getting these bolts out here. One is simply getting something in here to get hold of them and turn it, because it's just so tight in here. I'm going to be using this, Lord, what's it called? This breaker bar. You can use a ratchet. What's nice is that since the triple square's teeth separation is so small, you can get this into just exactly the right position that you need for the breaker bar. But your other challenge is that when you try and loosen this, the hub turns. And so there's a couple of answers to this. One is if you've got the tire and wheel on the other side still on, you can just lower the car down or put something like a hydraulic table under that other tire, lift it up, and that will stop this from rotating. Now I don't have that. I've taken the wheel and tire off on the other side, and plus I've got it so far up in the air to get access. Now in my case, I found that the best way to do this was to take a large socket and put it onto the axle nut, or the hub nut, whatever this is called. I can't remember exactly what Porsche calls that thing. Now this thing is torqued to like 350 pounds. So this more than tight enough that it's not going to move while I hold it to provide something to brace against to remove those bolts, or to at least loosen those bolts. I don't know what size this is. This is a very old socket that I inherited from my dad, and I just I can't find the markings on it to figure out what the size is, but it works really well. I have a whole set of these giant sized sockets that I inherited from my dad, and this one it happened to fit. Now, this is a little bit clumsy because normally I would have this a bit lower to get a better angle for turning this, but I've got it up high so you can see this. I'm holding the axle, or the breaker bar, holding the socket on the axle nut, and then I'm using my right hand to turn this other breaker bar. Just pushing the two against each other, and it breaks it loose. And then just get the next one, reposition the axle nut socket a bit, and just keep repeating this process. Once they're loosened up, you just take the bolts out using an impact driver, if you have one, and you need to make sure you don't lose these little, whatever they're called. I'm not sure exactly. I have no idea what they're called. I'm not sure exactly what they're for, unless they're something to counterbalance the rotational force to keep them from coming out. I don't know. If you know what these things are called or exactly why they're there, drop a comment down in the video description, or drop a comment put a comment in the comment section. And I'm just hand turning the wheel hub out here. And the last one. And this shaft is kind of spring-loaded, so you just pull it straight back, and it comes loose. And you can see now that that is just a plain machined hub. This side, well, there's no way for me to get a camera in there to show you. It has like a dome that fits into this area. But yeah, that's it. We're now completely loose from the transmission. Here is where we're going to experience a bifurcation of our process here, because it all depends, what comes next depends on whether we can get this joint apart. This is like the toe control arm. This is a ball joint with a tapered press fit up into the wheel carrier held together by that nut. If you can get this apart, you're golden. Then that's going to be the way you want to go. If you cannot get this apart, you're going to have to remove this bolt that holds the lateral control arm to the lower control arm and get that loose. And then you're going to have to remove the bolt on the other end and release the lower control arm from the engine subframe, or whatever Porsche calls that big aluminum piece up there that holds the entire rear end together, including the transmission and engine. So hopefully we can get this apart. As usual, I've treated it to several doses of CRC knocker loose. I have no concerns about getting that nut off of there. What worries me is getting this tapered press fit stud inside of here loose. The position, you're right underneath this hub, so you cannot use one of those ball joint separator tools. Now, you can try using one of these ball joint separator forks, but in my experience, when you jam it in there and drive this thing apart, what you end up doing is just tearing up this rubber boot here. So I'm going to avoid that if at all possible, even though at the moment I know that I'm replacing this lower control arm with a new one, so it wouldn't matter if I tore that thing up. But for the purposes of this video, I want to show you how to handle this if you don't, you're not replacing this. This is an 18mm nut, and you want to watch out because you don't want to screw up like I did one time, where I took a ratcheting end wrench, put it on here, and broke it loose and started getting the nut off of here. Well, this, as I rapidly discovered, was a grave tactical error, because as the nut came up, I was now trapped. I couldn't get the wrench off past the hub here. And of course, I couldn't back the nut back onto the stud because it would just ratchet. It wouldn't go backwards. So that was fun. I ended up having to keep the wrench in there and rig up something in order to hammer this joint apart. That was not fun. So I'm going to go ahead and use this 18mm wrench just to break this apart. Then I'm going to switch to the open end. Okay, it's now loose. Like I said, I was not worried about that coming loose at all. And I don't need to worry about holding it. There is a Torx bit socket in the end of this to keep this from spinning. It's not, I can see that it is not rotating, so I don't have to worry about that. But that also means that that press fit taper in here is jammed. So this isn't going to come apart nice and pretty the way I would like it to. I am grateful, however, that CRC knocker loose has made getting this this nut off of here super simple. Now, I've stopped taking the nut off so you can see that once it gets up to a certain point, there is no way to get this through there. That's what caused my crisis on a previous attempt at doing something like this. Just on a side note, they do make something that they call a ratcheting open end wrench. And it's not really a ratchet per se, but the geometry of the opening allows you to grab the nut, and then it easily will slide back and jump back to the next facet. I forget where I saw those, or maybe they don't even exist anymore. If you know of one, let me know down in the comments, because I'd love to check one of those things out. Okay, so I took the nut completely off to make sure it would come off easily, and then I put it back on and ran it down to where it's just over the top of the stud to get as many threads on as possible while still not exposing the top of the stud to what I'm about to do, which is hammer on it. I'm going to have to drop it down to get a proper angle to get in here with something to hammer down the thing. Hopefully, I can drive this apart. Looking a little more closely at this, this is the ball joint that we are trying to drive down out of the wheel carrier. Now, we need to support this so that we aren't just hammering this whole thing down and it's bouncing and rebounding and giving instead of transmitting the force into the shaft of this ball joint. But we also can't put something under here because, well, that would defeat the entire purpose of it. It will be supporting the thing that we're trying to push down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the car down. I'm going to remove this bolt that holds the dust shield or splash shield on, and I'm going to snuggle my floor jack right up under here and be lifting up on the hub or the wheel carrier here so that these hammer blows I'm going to be giving to the top of the stud, this can give and drop down and hopefully break loose. This is the theory. We'll see what actually happens. Well, as I feared, this ball joint was having none of it. It's a very clumsy bolt to get at above to try and hammer it back down, and it just proved impossible for this one. I've got them apart before like that. I even applied heat to this joint to try and expand it, and that has worked very well in the past, but not on this one. So we're going to have to resort to our other plan, which is to remove this bolt holding the lateral control arm on, and then we're going to remove this bolt here, which is holding the lower control arm and also providing our toe adjustment. Not toe, our camber adjustment. Okay, so we've got an 18 millimeter bolt head on the top here and a 21 millimeter nut on the top. So to work these two against each other. That's the theory. Oh my God. Nope. All right. It's having none of it. I'm going to have to go get my cheater bar. So I'm going to put my breaker bar into this long piece of pipe here to give me more leverage. There we go. Oh my goodness. That does not want to turn loose easily. Oh my gosh. Holy moly. Okay, I'm an idiot. I was tightening it. Let's try this again where I'm actually loosening this thing. Ah, yes. Finish it off with the impact driver. Okay, so we will be loose from this. There's no real way to take this off, so we'll just set it aside for now, or set the bolt aside. Next, we're going to want to remove this eccentric bolt here that's holding in the lower control arm, and we want to take careful note of the position of the bolt. And I think you can see it has markings on it, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach in here and I'm just going to mark the edge of that washer and then the support itself, so that when I put this back together, I just have to line those 2 marks back up, and it will come very close to the original camber setting, if not getting it dead on. The eccentric bolt is an 18 millimeter on this end and a 19 millimeter on this end, so I'm just using a pair of breaker bars. Oh gosh, that came loose so easily. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to a ratchet. If only the ball joint can come apart that easily. Now do make note of how this eccentric bolt is assembled. The nut is on this end, and then there's like a big washer, and you can see, I hope, the groove that's in the bolt. And this washer piece here, I don't think it's loose yet. Loose. Whoa, come back. You can see the shape of the hole that's in here. It fits over the bolt so that it maintains its relative position. And when trying to take it out, if you might take it out and it's going to be hitting this bolt right here. You just have to rotate the bolt so that the smallest part is facing that bolt, and it'll slide on out. You can see what I mean here by the way this eccentric bolt is formed. And this pushes against this little lip here and moves the bolt in and out, that sliding bolt. That's how you push the lower control arm in and out and control the camber. And again, on this end, you've got the bolt, and that little nub right there fits onto it like such. So remember, except you put it back together, make sure you put the markings on the outside. And there's my alignment mark that I'm going to use to get it back where it was. Now, before you pull the lower control arm out, you might have to deal with this little thing right here. If your car has the self-leveling or electronic headlight system, this bracket connects to a sensor up there. Basically, it's a potentiometer, and when the suspension deflects, it makes this arm go up and down, and so the sensor can relay that information to the computer, and it knows how much the suspension's going up and down, and it can adjust the headlight beam accordingly. There's one on the front and one on the back. Now, the problem is that there's a bolt running through, and on this end, because God knows we couldn't actually put a bolt with a head over here, you know, that would violate some kind of Porsche design law. If you try and just take this nut off on the back side, the shaft will start spinning. So just like the drop link for the sway bar, in the middle there's a tiny little hex portion that you can wiggle a 10 millimeter wrench. And then once we've got hold of that section, we kind of hold that wrench, and then I'm going to use a socket with a ratchet and an extender, and then I can remove that nut off the end of that thing. Very nearly dropped it. And now you can see this thing is loose, and we'll just kind of push it up and set it down out of our way. Oops. Actually, first we'll take and we'll put the nut back on it so we don't lose it. Now we'll take and tuck it up out of our way. Now this is a very tight connection, so you're going to have to do a lot of prying and grunting and wiggling to get this thing out of here. Okay. So now we're back under the hatch, And as you can see, I've already removed all the cover over this. If you need to know how to do that, refer back to my video that I did on how to remove the strut tower covers. And it'll show you how to do that. I don't want to repeat that here. And I also would highly recommend you do something like this. You take and tape over the holes and everything here, because it is so very easy to remove one of these nuts. It slips out of your fingers, it falls into a hole, and it disappears forever. One thing we have to take care of before we remove the strut is we have to disconnect this wire here. Now, this is the Porsche Active Suspension Management, or PASM wire, that it uses to control the strut. This is an electronically controlled strut. And if you don't have PASM, of course, you won't have this wire. You don't need to worry about it. But if you do, you need to disconnect it. Now, there's this little plastic thing that clips around the top of the strut, and it has a small clip on the side here where the wire pops into. So we just pop it out of there. And do note that it has a couple of yellow lines there that show you where the clip goes when you reinstall it. Now, the actual connector between the main wiring harness and this wire is kind of hidden back there. It's really hard to get a camera where you can see it. But to know how to disconnect it and what it looks like, refer back to my video on removing the front struts. And again, I'll give you a link down in the video description below that will have the timestamp jump you right to where I'm disconnecting the front PASM wire. Now that we've got the PASM wire disconnected, we can remove the 3 nuts that are holding the top of the strut in place. And I've already removed 2 of them. One is up here and this one back here. And then this final one here, which just it's a 13mm nut. And just be aware that as you're loosening this, the strut is dropping. And you can kind of see how this stud is slowly disappearing. And as you get down there to the very bottom, just kind of reach under here and hold on to the strut as you're taking that last bit off. And it'll shake loose and kind of drop a little bit. It won't drop all the way out because it's still being held up by everything. So now, let's go back up under the car. Okay, so now this is where things can get a little hairy because we've got a lot of moving parts. I mean, literally, a lot of moving parts. At the moment, the strut is kind of jammed up in the hole in the top of the fender and right here. You can see where this has slid down some right here. So we're going to pick this up and you're going to see the strut drop into this hole. And the idea is we're going to wiggle this apart and lower the wheel carrier so that we can get the strut out. Now, one of our biggest problems is that we're constrained by this parking brake or emergency brake cable. It's very stiff. There's very little play in it, and it really kind of makes this more difficult than it would otherwise be. Okay. So, you saw how that dropped down there. Now, pull this out, drop this down. There we go. And out comes the strut. Just kind of wiggle it, be careful. I really should have put some gaffer tape along here. I forgot about that, but we're good. And there's the strut. We've got the strut out of here, and I've got it clamped up in this vise, which is one of the many wonderful things that I inherited from my dad. This thing's probably 50 years old at least. It's a fantastic vise. It just works amazingly well. I wish it didn't have quite so much backlash in the mechanism, but hey, it's a cool vise. So now that we've got it out here, let's talk about, well, why might you have taken this thing out of here? And you might have been wanting to replace the spring, maybe with a higher or lower rate spring, or a lowering spring. Perhaps you want to replace this upper mount here because the bearing in it has gone bad. You might also want to be replacing this with a different type of top hat that has a different type of bearing, which is what I'm going to be doing with the Cayman. I'm going to be replacing this top part here with a spherical monoball. You might also want to be replacing, maybe this splash shield has cracked or broken, and something that's really quite common is to replace this bump stop, this rubber bump stop. They tend to decay. I'm not sure if it's ozone or what it is that gets to it, but the front ones I know on this car have totally decayed and fallen apart, and I've replaced those. These are in fine shape. I'm probably just going to leave those alone. No matter what reason you have for taking this strut out of the car, you're going to have to, unless you're replacing the entire strut, you're going to have to disassemble it. And that involves taking this nut off. And you're going to see two different setups here. This is with the PASM wire, where the wire is coming out of the top of the shaft. And then there's a nut, and then there's this dished washer underneath it. And if you have a non-PASM car, you're going to have, I believe it's a flat washer, and then you're going to have the nut. But the top of the stud, of course, or the top of the shaft, does not have the PASM wire. So what you're going to have instead, you're going to have a Torx socket there. And that way you can put the Torx bit in there to hold the shaft from spinning while you take that nut off. Now, that's simple and straightforward. With the PASM connector, however, you have a challenge because when you start trying to do this, you cannot hold the shaft. It's going to spin. The body, the actual strut itself, is going to spin inside of the spring, and there's no way to really hold it. So that's why Porsche has this dish washer. You can see these two slots in it. They have a special tool that clamps onto those two spots and holds it, and another special tool that goes over it like a socket with a slot for the wire, and then you use those two special tools to remove that nut. I do not have those two special tools. I don't know if Porsche sells them, but I imagine that they are ludicrously expensive if they do sell them, and I very much do not like buying single-purpose tools. So, as I showed when I did the front struts, I figured out a way to do this without having to buy those special tools. Before we start disassembling this, we need to remember that there is a definite orientation to this top mount. It has a definite angle to it, and these three bolts or these three studs are not equally spaced. They go into the body, the top of the fender, in a very specific, well, a single way. They only go one way, and we have to, when we put this back together, remember to put it on in the same direction it already was. And our reference point is this fin down here. This fin slides into a slot in the wheel carrier, and it is lined up with that stud. So before we go any further, let's go ahead and let's put a circle around that stud, and while we're at it, let's just put a line up here so that we can see that from all angles. And while we're at it, I'm going to darken the top of the stud also. Another way to do this would be using a paint marker, and this way we know exactly how we have to put it back together. Now, another thing we need to do before we take this thing apart is we need to relieve the pressure being exerted by the springs. Obviously, the spring is compressed and in here, and if we just take this off, well, things are going to go flying and somebody's probably going to lose an eye. So we're going to use spring compressors to squish them down and get all this loose before we take that nut off. I like these particularly. They make some others that are less expensive, and they're far flimsier. They tend to start bending under pressure, and they make me nervous. I'll give you a link to these in the video description down below. These are my preferred way of doing this. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to grab enough spring so we can pull it together, relieve the pressure. And often just grabbing 2 coils is not enough. So I prefer grabbing 3 coils, and the way to do that is by putting the bottom here on the actual bottom plate, and it's going to clamp down very tightly on the top of this coil, and so it's stable and safe. And then the other one is going to go up here, and I need to run this out a little more. It's going to hook onto the top coil there and pull it down. So we just adjust the body a bit, and then this collar screws down and clamps it all in place. And I need to get some more. I'm screwing this body so that it comes up here to give me enough thread to grab onto it. Tighten that down, make sure that it's nice and secure on there. You don't want this turning loose. And now that we've got that set, we do screw. There is like a bolt head on the bottom here that you tighten and it pulls it down. For right now, we're just going to tighten that up. And then as much as possible, we're going to come around 180 degrees to the other side. And here we're going to grab up onto this spring up at the top. And we're going to go down 2 coils. And grab this one. And sometimes you got to play games to get it where you can tighten this thing up correctly. And sometimes you even, after you get all this like put together, you end up having to take it out of the vise and rearrange a bit. Running the body up some more so I can get clamped on here good. All right. Tighten this up. And that feels good. Nice and stable. Now that I got it all set up, I'm going to use an impact driver with, this is an 18 millimeter that fits these. I'm going to take and just slowly work side to side and pull these springs tight. Or pull them, well, tight, loose, make sure. How you look at it. And, okay, now this spring seat here is now completely free from the top here, so I know that the pressure is off. Now the nut on here is a 19 millimeter and just an ordinary closed-end wrench. I find it's best to deal with it. But how do we hold this thing? And what I found is that the perfect tool, the perfect general purpose tool to get hold of that nut is a pipe wrench. So we're going to take, let's see, we're going to do it. We're going to be pulling it this way. No, we're going to be pulling it the other way. I just got to think this out. I'm going to be pulling this way. So this is going to be pulling this way to counteract it. Now, honestly, this is a bit finicky to set up. You got to get the thing just right so it's grabbed onto that strut or onto that washer. And then go in here with the wrench. Get these in the right position. Then brace this against my chest and turn. Okay. And once it breaks loose, very simple. This one didn't seem, since this lives inside, this one wasn't corroded at all. I didn't bother with hitting it with the CRC knocker loose. So we've got our nut that comes off, and then we've got our washer. And if you look closely, you'll see that the washer has like a tab in it, and that fits into, and I can just kind of, well, no, I really can't turn that. Use this to turn it. It fits into this slot, which is like the camber bolt that we took out of the lower control arm. Okay, remember that this goes dish up. And now this upper shock mount comes off. We have another dished washer. This one is dished down. Think of it as a radar dish. It's looking downward. Also, our spring seat comes off. Do take note of how it has a where it's pressed in there where the spring was sitting. I think it's best to line that up again. That way it doesn't have to like recompress and resettle into the rubber in a new position. If you need to remove the spring, you're going to have to release these spring clamps in order to uncompress them and take them off if you're putting new springs on. This bump stop just slides right out. It's attached to the, it has, let me just pull it apart. It has a ring here that fits into the groove in here where you can see this bump. To get that back in or get a new one in there, you just take it, like stick it in there and start turning it, and it will eventually work its way around. Just keep working it in there. I've never had this much trouble doing one before. Wow, it's being stubborn. There. Once you've done whatever you want to do, the reassembly is just the reverse. Start by putting the bump stop and shield back in. Remember, this washer goes down, and this is the washer that does not have the funky shaped hole in it. It just is a plain round washer. It goes dish side down on top of the strut shaft there. You also can go ahead and put back on. And do take note of these little dimples here. Okay. If you line up the spring seat with its original position, it'll be fine. These dimples are where these stud bottoms need to go. And again, since they're not symmetric, they only go one way. And we've got our marked one there. And it won't drop in there yet because we haven't uncompressed the spring. Put our special lock washer. And it uses that keyway to dig into or to keep the shaft from turning. Finish up with our nut. And then we would just reverse everything we did. We would torque this down, and that's a good point. Let's relieve the tension on our spring, or the compression on our spring, just by slowly working these two spring compressors and keeping an eye on those little spots where the bottoms of these studs need to go. And also remembering we need to keep this lined up with that fin down there. And again, if you've been keeping everything aligned with the spring seat going onto the spring in the same position, this should kind of all just fall into place where it's at. Okay, that's now loose, and that one's loose. Now the question becomes, How do you torque this nut? This nut on here needs to be torqued to 59 foot-pounds, and normally we would use a torque wrench with a socket on the end of it. However, with that wire, we can't use a socket. Now, what I did on the front struts was I was able to use this oxygen sensor wrench, which has a slot in the side, and you can just let the slot hang, the wire hanging through the slot, and put it onto the nut and use and torque it that way. The problem is that the nut on the rear struts is small, or smaller than the front ones, and so this oxygen sensor socket doesn't work. Now, you can take a regular socket, and I've seen people do this where they just take like a die grinder and they cut a slot. They sacrifice one of their sockets and make one, and I don't want to do that. So how do you torque something that you can't put a socket onto? And the answer, as you've seen in some of my other videos, is a crow's foot. Now, a crow's foot is basically an open-end wrench with a socket built into it so that you can grab hold of it with a typical ratchet driver or torque wrench. Now, you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, that changes the length of the torque wrench and it affects the settings. And that is absolutely correct. The way you fix that is you take and you turn the crow's foot at 90 degrees to the shaft of the torque wrench. This is now completely accurate. Okay, I screwed up. I showed how to do all this and use the crow's foot to torque this to value, and I forgot to start the camera. So I do not feel like taking this all back apart and doing it because it is kind of a tedious pain in the butt. So let me just tell you what I did. You take and get the crow's foot on here, and you have such a small window to work here, you need to set the crow's foot first. Then put the wrench on. Let me do it more like this. Then you put the wrench on and get it set. And the two handles are going to be pretty close together at that point. And you just tighten it. And then you're going to find you're probably going to run out of room before the torque wrench clicks. So now you have to back up one and reset your pipe wrench and then do this process again. If you go ahead and tighten it down as hard as you can with the regular wrench, you only have to do this a couple of times to get it where the torque wrench finally clicks. So I'm sorry I didn't record it, but I'm not going to redo it. Well, it's been a couple of days. After I finished reassembling the strut, I started feeling not so good and ended up taking a couple of days off just to try and recover from whatever bug I had contracted. And we're almost done, so it's we only have a little bit left. Well, you have a little bit left to do. I'm not going to actually walk through reassembling everything into the car because I've taken this out to completely replace a lot of the parts on the suspension. For example, here on the strut, I'm going to be replacing this upper strut mount with a new one from Terry Engineering that has a spherical monoball instead of this squishy rubber mount. And I'm going to be replacing the spring with some H&R Sport lowering springs. A lot of like the three arms that we were messing with, the trailing arm, the lower control arm, and the tow control arm are all going to be replaced with new adjustable versions that also feature the spherical monoball. It's just basically, I'm installing almost a race type suspension into the Cayman. So the way you're going to put it back together is basically do everything we did in reverse. So you're going to take and you're going to put the strut back into the wheel carrier, slide the lower control arm back into that bracket on that subframe that holds the suspension components as well as like the transmission mounts, and you're going to align that eccentric bolt up to the mark that you put on this so that your camber is set approximately, in fact, probably almost exactly back to what it should be, and so that will take care of that. And after that, you'll reattach the trailing arm to the lower control arm, put the bolts back in through the axle. You'll reattach the axle to the transmission using those 6 bolts. Don't forget those little crescent-shaped things, whatever they are. I try to put those back on in the same positions they were, but I don't worry about trying to get the hubs aligned exactly the way they were. I guess it would be simple to put a mark on there and make sure you do that. I don't think it's important though. Now, and then the last step would be to reattach the tow control arm onto the wheel carrier. Now, some torque values that you're going to need to know for the trailing arm, the arm that comes from the front to the lower control arm, that bolt is 118 foot-pounds. The eccentric bolt that controls the camber and attaches the lower control arm to the subframe is 74 foot-pounds. The drive shaft depends on what type of a bolt you've got there. Some Caymans came with M8 bolts, some came with M10 bolts. So the M8 bolts, if you have those, are 29 foot-pounds, and the M10s are over twice as much at 60 foot-pounds. So again, M8s are going to torque to 29 foot-pounds, M10s are going to torque to 60 foot-pounds. And then finally, the tow control arm, where that ball joint comes up through and attaches to the wheel carrier, that nut gets torqued down to 56 foot-pounds. And don't forget, you can use the torque socket on the end of it to hold it while you torque it down. Now, when you're torquing that down, you're going to need to use the same sort of trick like I used on the top here, using that crow's foot and your torque wrench in order to do that, because since you're holding the top of it, you can't get a socket onto it. And even if you have a socket with a slot cut out of it, it's not going to work in that situation. So get a set of crow's feet. It's really worth it, and they're not expensive. I think I've already said it, but I'll give you a link to the ones I use in the description down below. Now, in terms of the alignment, you should go get an alignment done on your rear suspension, even though, since we didn't take out the tow control arm, the only thing that could have changed would be the camber. The camber is not like super critical to get exactly right. There's quite a wide range that Porsche gives you. I will look that up and I will stick it here somewhere of what it's like. I want to say that it's a a quarter degree plus or minus a quarter degree, or a half degree plus or minus a quarter, but I'll give it to you somewhere here. And that's a pretty wide range. But if you want to take it in and get it aligned and checked, that's a good idea. However, if you want to just do it yourself, I highly recommend this camber caster gauge from 10 Holes in Automotive. This thing is super accurate, super easy to use, and it's a bit pricey. It's about $200. I don't know what inflation has done to it by the time you see this, but if you use it to do, a couple, maybe even only one alignment on your car yourself, you will cover the cost of this tool. So I highly recommend it. It's super accurate. I like it. Buy one. Now, before you go down there, smash that thumbs up button. Give me a like on this video. Let YouTube know that you enjoyed this content, you found it valuable. It helps me a lot in terms of growing the channel and doing even more content like this. If you're not one of my subscribers, go down there, find that big shiny red subscribe button, give it a click. It doesn't cost a thing, and it will make your day. Trust me on that one. If you are a subscriber, go check it, make sure that it's still gray and it hasn't turned back to red. For some reason lately, there's been some problems with people becoming magically unsubscribed to the channel. I didn't think it was a real thing when I heard other people talking about it, other content creators, but it turns out to be true. So go check that button. Oh, I forgot to mention, if you want all the details on this massive suspension upgrade that I'm doing to the Cayman, I'm going to give you a link in that corner right up there that takes you to my introduction video that lays out all the parts that I'm replacing and upgrading. Go check it out. And finally, if you want to keep up with all the stuff I'm doing to the Cayman, including this massive suspension upgrade and the other things I'm getting ready to do with it in terms of aerodynamics and some other surprises coming up, go click that bell icon. That turns on notifications for this channel, and that way YouTube will let you know every time that I post something new from here in Cliff's Garage. I'll see you next time.